Welcome to Marquis Mondays, the final program in our webinar series featuring authors who have written books related to the Marquis de Lafayette. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Tom Chaffin, author of the book Revolutionary Brothers, Thomas Jefferson, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the Friendship That Helped Forge Two Nations, which was published by St. Martin's in 2019. The Wall Street Journal called the Revolutionary Brothers book a gripping narrative that offers a revelatory perspective on the combined origins of two nations, compelling drama, and instructive history. The American Scholar described it as rich in narrative detail for those who enjoy their history, chock full of action and anecdotes. Historian Walter S. Isaacson, the bestseller author of Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, called it a compelling narrative of an epic and unlikely friendship from the Enlightenment era, enlivened by bracing plot turns and vividly drawn characters, a fascinating read. Chaffin was born and grew up in Atlanta and spent his early professional years in journalism, living in, among other places, Savannah, New York City, San Francisco, and Paris. Having written several books, Tom has articles, reviews, and essays that have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Time, Harper's, The Nation, Oxford American, The Atlantic, American Scholar, and other publications. Living in Atlanta, once again, he holds a BA in English from the Georgia State University, an MA in American Studies from New York University, and a PhD in U.S. History from Emory University. He has taught U.S. history and writing at various universities and was a Fulbright Fellow in Ireland in 2012. Good news, on occasion, Chaffin conducts private one-on-one online tutorials for aspiring authors of historical narratives, biographies, and memoirs. Interested parties may contact him via his website, tomchaffin.com. It is my pleasure to welcome Tom Chaffin. Tom?
Thank you, Kathleen, for that kind introduction. I'm likewise grateful to all of you who've made time to join us this evening. The 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's 1824 through 1825 tour of our country is worth a celebration, and I'm honored to play a small role in your own festivities. That tour, the one we now celebrate, was conducted over 14 months, between July 1824 and September 1825. It took Lafayette to 182 towns and to all of that day's 24 U.S. states. He undertook the tour at the invitation of the U.S. government, which covered his travel costs. But that tour was actually not Lafayette's first U.S. tour. First, 4 decades earlier, following the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which formalized the conclusion of the American Revolution, he soon returned from France to the United States to conduct essentially a victory lap. And in contrast to his later tour, he undertook that first tour on his own and funded it in large part out of his own pocket. That tour unfolded over 5 months, between August and December 1784, and it brought Lafayette to 10 of the then 13 states, all except for the Carolinas and Georgia. The Articles of Confederation, America's first governing document, was in place then, and in contrast to the later Constitution U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, the Articles of Confederation, which had been ratified in 1781, provided America with a weaker and much more decentralized national government. In fact, during his travels, Lafayette witnessed during his travels on that tour, Lafayette witnessed what he viewed as a disturbing fraying of the national unity that by his lights had reigned during the recent war. And in response to those trends, he championed during that tour what he called federalism, and thus became a unifying symbol of American nationalism. Coincidentally, it was during that tour that Lafayette's friend Thomas Jefferson accepted and took up a diplomatic posting in Paris. And so it's in 1784, during Lafayette's first American tour, as Jefferson was settling into his Paris diplomatic posting, that the story I want to share with you this evening commences. In 1784, the Marquis de Lafayette was anticipating his friend Thomas Jefferson's imminent arrival in Paris to begin his stint as a neophyte U.S. diplomat. The American Revolution behind him, Lafayette by then was again living in Paris with his family. But Lafayette also knew that he would be away touring America when Jefferson arrived in Paris. Thus, determined to make his American friend feel welcome, he wrote a letter to Jefferson. Quote, "My house, dear sir, my family, and anything that is mine are entirely at your disposal, and I beg you will come and see Madame de Lafayette as you would by your brother's wife." Close quote. Reciprocating such affections, Jefferson, 3 years later, still in France but traveling in its south, wrote to Lafayette. In his letter, Jefferson complained that decorum often prohibited the expression of personal truths that may have the air of flattery, quote, in quotes, may have the air of flattery, in quotes. Even so, brushing conventions aside, Jefferson concluded that his letter with an admission, "I content myself, therefore, with saying once and for all that I love you, your wife and children. Tell them so and adieu. Yours affectionately, Thomas Jefferson." Close quote. Over the years, Jefferson and Lafayette shared a 4-decade friendship. In many ways, their bond was unlikely. Jefferson was 14 years older than Lafayette. Moreover, while Lafayette possessed a seemingly insatiable hunger for publicity, Jefferson, Jefferson, not without his vanities, also had a passion for privacy, even secrecy. Reflecting those different attitudes, Jefferson, writing to James Madison in 1787, faulted his French friend for possessing, quote, "a canine appetite for popularity and fame." Equally important, Lafayette, through his ancestry, his immediate family, education, and ambitions, was steeped in the military and military traditions. Jefferson, by contrast, by temperament, education, and professional pursuits, lacked interest or experience in military affairs. So, what brought these two men together? Before we go further, I want to be clear. By 4-decade friendship, I refer not to a relationship built upon great stretches of shared time together. Theirs, rather, was a bond forged by 2 distinct periods, set respectively in Virginia and Paris, that led to decades of abiding loyalties and affections, spread over expansive realms of time and space. So again, what brought these two men together? Well, the answer is most immediately random circumstances occasioned their bond. To wit, each man in successive locales over the years confronted crises in which the other's expertise generously offered saved the day. As an aged Jefferson wrote to Lafayette in November 1823, quote, "We have gone through too many trying scenes together to forget the sympathies and affections they nourished. Your trails have been long and severe." Close quote. But such instances of reciprocal goodwill failed to explain their bond's lasting duration. 4 decades, after all, is a long time. So what shared personal traits sustained their friendship? What personal qualities did they have in common? Well, certainly they shared wide-ranging and robust curiosities and interests in history, indigenous cultures, the company of women, and languages, to name a few. My own view is that Jefferson's bond with Lafayette also flourished due in large part to similar backgrounds. Jefferson's native soil and his estate, Monticello, lay in Virginia's Piedmont region. And similarly, Lafayette hailed from the Auvergne, a mountainous region in south-central France that even today numbers among France's less populated and remote realms. More to the point, though Lafayette possessed far greater wealth than Jefferson would ever know, both men were affluent aristocrats, but of provincial origins. Equally important, due to those origins, neither were ever completely comfortable amid the more urbane precincts of their respective national capitals. Acting separately and together, however, the two helped shape the destinies of two great nations, the United States and the Republic of France. Jefferson, of course, drafted the Declaration of Independence. He also served as the first U.S. Secretary of State, and his achievements as the third U.S. president included the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which doubled the land area of the United States. In recent years, of course, Jefferson's achievements have been overshadowed by confirmation of his long-rumored relations with the enslaved woman Sally Hemings, and more generally by his hypocrisies on matters concerning race and slavery. As for Lafayette, in addition to his heroism as a major general in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, he championed, indeed he came to symbolize, the alliance with France that proved decisive in winning U.S. independence from Britain. But who exactly was Lafayette? America teems with places that bear his name: parks, schools, streets, squares, towns, and counties. Indeed, just across from the White House, there's Lafayette Square. And as most joining us are aware, in Lancaster, there's Lafayette Tower Park, among other local places and institutions that commemorate Lafayette's passage through the area 200 years ago in late July 1825. Indeed, not until while writing Revolutionary Brothers, my book on Jefferson and Lafayette, did I appreciate his name's ubiquity in my own life. I spent my early professional years in journalism, and decades ago, as a young newspaper reporter in Savannah, I lived a few blocks from Lafayette Square. And later, when I lived in Lower Manhattan, my apartment was a few blocks from Lafayette Street. And still later in San Francisco, I had an apartment a few blocks from Lafayette Park. And just across the bay from San Francisco, in Costa County, there was the town of Lafayette, California. Ironically, not to make too fine a point of it, but in the mid-'80s, when I lived in Paris for a year, in the city's unfashionable 20th arrondissement, I lived about a mile and a half from Lafayette's grave, and at the time was completely oblivious to it. I only learned that while working on this book. So much for the observant journalist. Anyway, think about all the places we've named for Lafayette. Now, contrast the ubiquity of Lafayette's name in American life with how little most Americans know about the life of this daring-do but complex figure. And it might be fair to call Lafayette both the best and the least known of our early national heroes. At this point, it's probably fair to ask, what's going on here? That blind spot regarding Lafayette among Americans probably owes much to the fact that our hero was French, or more to the point, that Lafayette was a foreigner who did not linger here after helping us win our independence. In our civic memory, he materializes in 1777, and over the next few years, his name becomes associated with American Revolution place names such as Brandywine Creek, Valley Forge, Monmouth Courthouse, and Yorktown. He arrives in America in July 1777 and stays until January 1782, long enough to, with General Washington, accept the surrender of General Cornwallis's British forces at Yorktown in 1781. Then, like the Lone Ranger, he disappears. Yes, many Americans know that years later, for his 1824-25 tour, the one we celebrate this evening, he returned here. He heard some tributes and had some places named for him. Even so, many, perhaps most Americans have no idea of what became of Lafayette after Yorktown, or just who he was in the first place. The fact that the French failed to revere Lafayette as much as we think they should only compounds the confusion. Typifying that alleged French indifference, a bronze statue of the hero, a gift from American school children who raised funds for the work, which stood for decades in the Louvre's courtyard, was removed in the 1980s to make room for architect I.M. Pei's glass pyramid. In Revolutionary Brothers, I try to resolve some of the confusion surrounding those and many other matters, as well as to chronicle the arc of a remarkable friendship and collaboration. Lafayette was born in 1757. In 1774, at age 16, his already considerable riches grew still more. In an arranged marriage, he wed 14-year-old Marie Adrienne de Noailles, daughter of a wealthy, well-connected French nobleman. By August 1775, infatuated with the rebellion in America, he was scheming to find his way into that distant war. During those years, France's Bourbon rulers, fresh from a defeat in France's recent war with Britain, were in no hurry to antagonize America's colonial overseers. French officials thus blocked several efforts by Lafayette to leave France with men and material for the American rebels. Even so, his persistence eventually paid off. Slipping out of a port on Spain's Atlantic coast and aboard his own ship, La Victoire, he arrived in the United States in June 1777 at age 19. Following 4 months at sea, he landed near Georgetown, South Carolina, and briefly visited Charleston. From there, traveling overland, he and his coterie by late July had found their way to Philadelphia. There he introduced himself to General Washington and reported for duty to the Continental Congress and its Continental Army. Not until 4 years later, in 1781, late in the American Revolution, did Lafayette finally meet Jefferson. When the two first met in Richmond, Virginia, the state capital, Jefferson was a 38-year-old beleaguered and by then widely scorned wartime governor confronting an invasion of his state by British forces. I should probably add that Jefferson's governorship of Virginia probably represented the nadir of his entire public career. In the summer of 1776, after drafting the Declaration of Independence, he had initially departed Philadelphia and returned to Virginia, and no widespread fame had resulted from that authorship. His authorship of that founding document was not widely known until the 1790s. After returning to Virginia, Jefferson resumed his service in the state legislature. There, 2 years later, fellow lawmakers coaxed him into seeking the governor's office. He became governor in 1779, and from day one, the office of wartime governor proved for Jefferson an unedifying experience. Beyond longing for the familiar comforts of his Monticello estate in Virginia's Piedmont and bored by the office's administrative duties, he found himself caught between the competing demands of the federal government in Philadelphia, demanding that Virginia do more to support the war effort, and a Virginia citizenry resistant to such pleadings. In its early years, after all, the war had barely reached Virginia. Among the lowest points of Jefferson's 2-year gubernatorial term came in January 1781, when British forces under General Benedict Arnold conducted a successful raid on Richmond. In the wake of that raid, and amid increased redcoat incursions across Virginia, General Washington dispatched Lafayette, by then 23, to the state. Lafayette eventually arrived in Richmond in April 1781, just in time to spare Governor Jefferson the embarrassment of 2 British raids on his state's capital in a 4-month period. It was thus in 1781 that the two men's friendship commenced. Not until 3 years later, however, in Paris did their collaborations truly blossom. Indeed, between 1784 and 1789, in Paris and Versailles, Lafayette served Jefferson as a close counselor and generally opened doors for the neophyte emissary. And in letters to Congress during those years, both men sounded alarms concerning the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation, the infant nation's weak governing document, or more specifically, their letters alerted officials in Philadelphia to that document's weakness in projecting American power abroad and winning the respect of and influence with European governments. And in the end, their two-man chorus from foreign shores strengthened the case of domestic leaders in Philadelphia arguing for a new, stronger governing document for America, the U.S. Constitution, eventually adopted in 1787. Commensurately, when Lafayette, serving in successive French National Assemblies, plunged into the reformist politics of his native country, Jefferson provided his friend with sound Republican counsel. To be sure, the Virginian eventually acted as a reliable sounding board as Lafayette drafted what became the French Revolution's signature document, 1789's Declaration of the Rights of Man. As I mentioned earlier, for Jefferson, recognition for writing the Declaration of Independence did not come for decades. By contrast, as indicated by this 1791 allegorical engraving depicting Lafayette and his Declaration of the Rights of Man, co-author the Marquis de Mirabeau, for Lafayette, credit for his role in creating the French Revolution's seminal document came literally overnight. But despite their achievements, both men have problematic legacies in their respective native lands. Most prominently, Jefferson's achievement as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, with its all men are created equal affirmation, is tainted by his well-known public and private hypocrisies on matters of race and slavery. My time is limited here tonight, but for those who are interested, I want to note that Revolutionary Brothers' account of the Jefferson-Lafayette friendship and the two men's individual lives also includes detailed accounts of both the Lafayette and Jefferson households. The latter includes an extensive account of the death of Jefferson's wife, Martha, in 1782, a passing that gave him the freedom to accept his foreign diplomatic posting. I also chronicle at length the evolution of Jefferson's Paris household, which eventually included his daughters Patsy and Polly Jefferson, as well as the enslaved siblings from Monticello, James and Sally Hemings, the latter with whom Jefferson likely fathered 6 children. In stark contrast to Jefferson's equivocations and hypocrisies on matters of race, Lafayette, soon after arriving in America in 1777, and with deepening resolve in subsequent years, came to question the moral efficacy of human chattel slavery. He even tried, without success, to convert Jefferson and George Washington to his views. As English abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, a Lafayette ally and correspondent, recalled of his friend, quote, "He was decidedly as uncompromising an enemy to the slave trade and slavery as any man I ever knew." Close quote. Indeed, remembered Clarkson, Lafayette often reflected, quote, I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that I was hereby founding a land of slavery. In 2017, prior to writing Revolutionary Brothers, I published Giant's Causeway, a book that chronicles the abolitionist Frederick Douglass's 1845 to 1847 lecture tour of Ireland and Britain, a deeply transformative episode in Douglass's life. And from my research for that book, I can assure you that the abolitionist orator and writer was no Jefferson admirer. Indeed, what to the slave is the 4th of July, among Douglass's most admired lectures, indicted Jefferson and his Continental Congress colleagues for a galling hypocrisy. But Douglass took a different view of the man Voltaire called the hero of two worlds. During an 1886 visit to Lafayette's grave in East Paris's Pipka Cemetery, Douglass reflected, quote, "This spot is doubly hallowed. This patriot had 2 countries for his own." And today, each year on July 4th, the date that commemorates the Declaration of Independence drafted by Lafayette's friend Thomas Jefferson, a ceremony attended by American and French officials replaces the grave's American flag. But Douglass's veneration of Lafayette, like that of many Americans, failed to appreciate the complexity of the Frenchman's reputation in his native country. Lafayette's victories in America notwithstanding, his performance in his own country's subsequent revolution, commenced in 1789, proved increasingly fraught. Those difficulties arose in part from the casting of Lafayette into both civil and military roles. By contrast, only once in his lifetime as Virginia's governor was Jefferson, a gifted writer and politician, summoned to military tasks, duties outside of his established expertises. As a reformer, Lafayette proved himself an able leader during the French Revolution's early years. But as the uprising grew more radical, his aristocratic background and ties to the country's Bourbon monarchs nourished distrust of his motives. Among the revolution's nourished distrust of his motives among the revolution's more strident leaders. Indeed, by 1792, captured abroad while leading a French army in Austria-ruled Holland, today's Belgium, Lafayette found himself a man without a country, scorned by the leaders of France's revolution and feared by Europe's still reigning monarchs. He languished for 5 years in a series of Austrian and Prussian prisons. Decades later, the French writer and politician François-René de Chabrillon described Lafayette as a flawed figure, whose well-earned American successes had elevated him into leadership roles in his native land, for which a lack of political adroitness left him woefully ill-equipped, wrote Chateaubriand. In the New World, Monsieur de Lafayette contributed to the creation of a new society. In the Old World, to the destruction of an old one. Freedom invokes him in Washington, anarchy in Paris. Monsieur de Lafayette had only one idea, and happily for him it was that of the century. The fixity of that idea created his empire. It served to blinker him. It prevented him from looking to left or right. He marched with a firm step on a single track. He advanced without tumbling over precipices, not because he saw them, but because he did not. Blindness took the place of genius in him. Everything fixed is fatal, and whatever fatal is powerful. Close quote. Both Jefferson and Lafayette took pains during their lives to burnish the reputations they would leave for future generations. But those efforts could not fully insulate their reputations from what the historian E.B. Thompson called the, quote, the enormous condescension of posterity. Even so, the two men's individual shortcomings aside, the transatlantic alliance they promoted has endured and, despite past and current challenges, survives today. During Lafayette's final tour, a frail Thomas Jefferson in 1824, at a formal dinner honoring his friend, recalled their Paris collaborations. When I was stationed in his country for the purpose of cementing its friendship with ours and of advancing our mutual interests, this friend of mine was my most powerful auxiliary and advocate. He made our cause his own, as in truth it was that of his native country also. His influence and connections there were great. All doors of all departments were open to him at all times. In truth, I only held the nail, he drove it. That tribute would be Thomas Jefferson's final public speech. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. At this time, DAR Regent Debbie Thompson will conduct a Q&A session. Debbie. And Tom? Yes, there you are. Good.
Good evening. Tom, how did you decide to write about the relationship between Lafayette and Jefferson?
I can't think of any kind of epiphany moment. It's just I just became aware that these two seemingly very different men had this friendship that straddled two continents, and I got interested in it. And I found that there had been many years ago there was a book written on it, but it didn't capture the whole story. I just felt like there was a story there, so I started looking around. And plus, and I also have a lot of affections for Paris, so, in France. So,
So you enjoy Paris.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Can you describe the research process you used for your book?
Well, when I'm starting a book, I I've the main I mean the main
Frozen here.
seems like hello.
Yes, I think you're back.
Okay. Anyway, once I've decided there's enough, material out there um, to sustain the research, I do a kind of triage of places that I want to visit. You can't visit every settings of all the scenes in the book, but I find that visiting places that are going to be the setting for scenes in the book is helpful. So I had a fellowship at um, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, but by luck I had this. For a month I lived in this farmhouse on property that Jefferson. It's next door to Monticello. I mean, it's down the road,
Oh,
but this is like in winter. But I had this like farmhouse that it was on property that I think at one point it belonged to after his death it belonged to one of his daughters, and
okay.
and then anyway I was able to just take hikes around there and visit these places that were scenes, wilderness scenes really that he had great affection for. And then I made a trip to France of several years and several weeks, and I was able to get access to the final. It's in private hands now. It was the final apartment that Jefferson or Lafayette occupied, and with an old friend who lives in Toulouse, we retraced some of his travels in south of France.
So you had some very nice friends who got you into
Yeah,
some places most
yeah.
people can't get.
But I
That's
was going to say
cool.
about the apartment. I think that that figures like maybe one sentence in the book, but it's just
But
when
it's
you're working.
nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just a kind of tactile,
Hmm.
get a kind of tactile immediacy with the.
Okay. Did you discover anything in your research that gave you a pretty big surprise?
Let me see. I haven't thought about this book in a while. Um, I probably did, but it doesn't come. I think most. I think I just I changed my view on Lafayette. I think whether I knew it or not, I had this sense that he was like a lot of his contemporaries regard him as a kind of grandstander with
Hmm.
substance. But by the by the time I finished the work, he seemed to. I think he was far more substantive than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you like to tell the people out there where they can purchase your book from?
Well, your local independent bookstore. Uh, I'm sure you have some nice ones there in your town, and or it's you can, Amazon or whatever. It's all the Yeah, Amazon or independent bookstore.
Okay. And what kind of a closing message do you have that you would like to tell our audiences regarding the relationship between Lafayette and Jefferson?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. Uh, no, it was unlikely. And they truly loved one another. I mean, Jefferson rarely shows any emotion in most of his letters. He was,
Huh.
but he did for Lafayette.
Okay. And Jefferson was fluent in French, correct?
Not really. I mean,
Good enough to get by?
uh, well, that's actually kind of exaggerated. He wasn't really. Um, he couldn't engage in like intellectual conversations. I mean, he had a kind of rudimentary command of French, and he only wrote one letter in French while he was during that 5 years of his diploma. Actually, Lafayette wrote a lot of his letters, and Lafayette also sort of showed him the ropes um, at Versailles.
Okay.
And by the way, there's an interesting, and this is in my book too. Jefferson. There was a famous Jefferson. He was the second U.S. Envoy to France after Benjamin Franklin, and he's famous for saying something like that no one can replace Benjamin Franklin. But the fact is, the two guys hated one another.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, the other thing is they had a very different, like Washington and Jefferson did not have a warm and fuzzy relationship. Jefferson, even though he was maybe 50 miles from Mount Vernon,
Mm-hmm.
he didn't attend Washington's funeral.
Hmm.
But Martha and George Washington, because they had no children, they sort of adopted Lafayette as their son, so they had
Mm-hmm.
great affection. Anyway.
Okay. All right. I have a young lady by the name of Amy. She wants to know how you feel about the portrayal of the two men in the hit Hamilton.
I like that. I mean, there's not this. It's based on what's his name's biography of Hamilton. Somebody help me there. I'm trying to. Anyway, the depictions are I mean, obviously, are not wrongheaded. Yeah, I like that.
Okay.
I like that a
Okay.
lot. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Except for George III, maybe. I think this is more the playwright. Um, George III was not as kind of not as bad as the American patriots portrayed him to be.
Okay.
Yeah,
Someone said it was Ron Chernow.
yeah, correct. That's right. Yeah, it's
Okay.
been a while.
All right. I don't see any more questions at this point in time. Kathleen?
Thanks so much, Debbie. We extend our sincere thanks to you, Tom, to you, Debbie, to you, Leslie, and to all of you in our audience for making our 6-month Marquee Monday series a huge success. On this 4th of July, we invite you to take just a moment to think about the daring, young, 19-year-old Frenchman who bought his own ship, sailed across the ocean to join the American cause for freedom and liberty. We owe Lafayette an enormous debt of gratitude. May his legacy live on. Happy 4th, everyone. Bonsoir. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.